Thanks for staying with us on SABC News. Government's overall response to the KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern Cape flood disasters has been described as too slow, according to the Auditor General's report on the disaster response. Government initiatives were not rolled out fast enough, and its ability to respond to the disaster was not adequate. The Office of the Auditor General has been conducting real-time audits on the funds allocated for relief efforts. Earlier today, Auditor General Maluleke presented the outcomes to the Ad Hoc Joint Committee on Flood Disaster Relief and Recovery. She says the most irregularities were found with procurement controls by the Public Works Department's property management trading entity in the repair of infrastructure owned or rented by the department. There was also a delay in the delivery of water to communities in need. Members of Parliament have indicated that the outcomes of the report convey what they also experienced during their visit to affected areas of KwaZulu-Natal in the past week. The slow response is attributed to the lack of capacity, inadequate project management and ineffective monitoring. Maluleke has called for government to urgently strengthen internal controls and disaster management capability. SABC News economics reporter Gloria Sefako-Musi has more.
Well, the Auditor General has just completed a brief to Parliament on the real-time audit outcomes of the funds that were set aside for disaster relief in KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape following the disasters that we've seen earlier this year. Remember that the President had called for real-time audits so that there can be proper accountability for these funds that have been set aside. Well, in the report, the overall impression that we are getting is that government's response to the disaster has been slow, and there was an inadequate assessment of needs on the ground. There was issues with water delivery, communities going for about a day without water. But for more on this, we are joined now by the Auditor General, Maluleke. Thank you so much for joining us. What would you say are the highlights of this report? What do we take out from it?
Thank you so much for having me. I think one of the critical things we must take out of it is that government's response to these disasters was hampered by the lack of capacity to manage disasters. And it's something that we all need to learn in terms of putting in some effort to build the capability to respond to disasters. Part of it is about building institutional strength in individual public institutions from preventative controls, but also making sure that there is proper coordination across different parts of government. One of the things that continues to bedevil the governance system here is really about the inability of different spheres of government, different institutions within government to collaborate effectively in executing initiatives. Those two things, lack of institutional controls, but also the lack of coordination across different parts of government, they've actually hampered the impact of what are actually well-designed initiatives that were meant to respond to the disaster. Another point I'd like to make is that these things we need to continue to build on. So when we did the real-time audits on COVID, we found that the SASA part of it, that institution responded to the findings and recommendations that we issued following the COVID-19 audited response. And as a consequence, this time around, we found fewer instances of invalid payments made by SASA. So they've learned and they've been responsive in implementing the key commitments that they made at the end of last time. On the other side of the spectrum, we found that some institutions didn't learn from the COVID response, and we found the same findings, the same issues, which really do hamper service delivery, which compromise the ability to benefit properly from the public purse.
Overall, what are the kind of problems that we're seeing with the COVID response? We've seen the scandals that came about with the COVID response. Are we seeing the same thing that is likely to happen as well?
What we've seen is that where people learn from the COVID response and they implement the things that need to be improved, things run much better, such as the social relief program. Where people don't respond to our findings, we find the same thing. So, for example, when we looked at the water tankering services, we found the same problems as we found after the COVID one. When we dealt with the matters at PMTE, which was fixing the government departments that had been damaged by the floods, we found similar problems. So, our view is that we've got to insist that accounting officers, as the appointed stewards over public institutions, implement the necessary improvements in their controls. We've got to insist that executive authorities who supervise those accounting officers monitor that the commitments made following an audit are actually being implemented, because that's how we're going to build institutional strength and even improve the ability to coordinate so that we're better prepared for the next disaster or the next crisis.
Can you take us through the challenges that we've identified in terms of the Public Works Department in repairing the buildings that were damaged in the flood?
There we found problems around the procurement processes, and it's the same issues that we flagged before in terms of procurement processes that are not run in a manner that's consistent with the law. You end up with conflicts that are not being disclosed or managed properly, where there are instances where some of the companies being allocated work are owned by people who are employed in the state or are spouses to people in the state. We found instances where there was inappropriate appointment of service providers, where payments were made to service providers beyond what was budgeted for, those sorts of things which impede the ability of that program to be implemented in a way that's efficient and that's cost effective.
And in terms of referrals of these irregularities for investigation to law enforcement?
We haven't referred them yet because, and this is quite important to note, we will refer when we do not get comfort, when we do not get a commitment from the accounting officer and the executive authority that they will act on our findings, because it is those people to whom we must look to implement the necessary improvements. So what we did was we issued these findings, and you would have read that Minister DeLille herself, who is the executive authority responsible for that department, has indicated that they will be dealing with the matters that the AG has raised. Ours is to give them the opportunity to implement those. She, as executive authority, as well as the DG that's in the department, they've got to implement the necessary controls. They've got to follow up on matters, whether it's about disciplinary issues, all of that, controls matters. Ours is to track that they implement the necessary action that the law provides for. It is only if they don't do that, or if we don't even get an appropriate commitment that we'll do that, that we will then implement our powers of referral, ultimately leading to remedial action and eventually a certificate of debt.
Thank you very much for your time. That is the Auditor General, Mr. Kane Maluleke, talking to us there about the outcomes of the audit that was done on the relief funds that were set aside for the floods in KwaZulu-Natal, the relief for people that experienced that devastating floods that we saw earlier this year. Well, it's back to you in studio.